or not, but we'll try it and see. But the dispersion or the diaspora was something that was really quite an amazing thing. It was part and parcel of Judaism from the very beginning. The dispersion is where the Jews are uprooted and taken somewhere else. And then they go from there to yet another place. And actually, the entire Jewish nation begins with a dispersion, a diaspora, from, of all places, Ur of the Chaldees. That's the first Jewish diaspora where Abraham and Terah, his father, are dispersed to Haran, and then when Terah dies, Abram is dispersed to places unknown, which is Canaan, where the family pretty much stays until late in the life of Jacob. And then the next diaspora or dispersion takes place when Jacob and his family go where? Down to Egypt. And they stay there for about 450 years, and then they're dispersed to where for the next 40 years?
The wilderness.
Into the Sinai wilderness. And then they're dispersed again into what land? Canaan. Where they stay for quite some time, and then during the time of Sennacherib the Assyrian, the 10 tribes, the 10 northern tribes of Israel are dispersed to all over the Assyrian world and never return. And then about 100 years later, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin are dispersed to for 70 years to where? Babylon, where, by the way, the vast majority of those living there for those 70 years stayed when the people were dispersed back to the land of Canaan, or the promised land, under the auspices of the likes of Zerubbabel and Joshua and Nehemiah and Ezra. And then the next dispersion, and really in terms of numbers, the greatest dispersion was after the Old Testament ended, during the time of the Maccabees, when the Greeks were oppressing the Jews. People fled the land to all over the known world. In fact, by the time of Christ, we're told by many authorities that there were more Jews living outside of Palestine than were living in Palestine. And the next great dispersion was, of course, in 70 A.D. when Jerusalem was destroyed and the nation disintegrated. But there was another dispersion that this book is addressed to. And so that will be our first question. Who is the diaspora or the dispersion that James speaks to? It is really a very, in terms of numbers, right minor, but in terms of God's plan, it's very major. And the answer to that question is found in Acts chapter 8 and verse 4. Does anybody know what Luke tells us in Acts chapter 8 and verse 4? Just right offhand. Right after the...
it's talking about the Christians being dispersed because of persecution.
Yeah, specifically because...
Mainly from Paul.
Yeah.
Paul.
Yeah, this man, Saul of Tarsus, was creating terror in the Christian community to a point where people literally left everything and got out of town, literally fleeing for their lives, and they were going everywhere they could get to. And this is a subset dispersion of Jewish Christians. There are no Gentile Christians apparently at this early stage. And so James writes them this letter. This is the dispersion. Now, where though, or should I say this, of all the Christians in Jerusalem after the persecution of Saul, what Christians remained in Jerusalem? Does anybody remember?
Peter did.
It was
Apostles, yeah.
Yeah, the apostles did. Apparently, plus one. Who was the plus one?
James.
It was James. James stayed behind in Jerusalem with the apostles. And we're going to be asking some questions tonight I don't have the answers to, because it's really quite puzzling to me about James and his role in the church in those early years. But James resided in Jerusalem, and it is from here apparently he writes this epistle to the dispersed Jewish Christians who are now scattered all over the Mediterranean area there. Probably a good number of them went to Alexandria, and a good number probably went most likely to Antioch as a result. But they got out of Palestine because it was just too dangerous to be there. Now, here's my question, and I don't have an answer to this, and it is this. Was James, in fact, a presiding elder in the church at Jerusalem, or did he hold some other kind of office that we're unaware of? I'm puzzled at James's leadership at the head of all the others that are mentioned, and I've got some passages I want to call our attention to. I want to ask Nancy.
What?
Would you hand me my Bible, please? But I would just want to review what the New Testament says about James after 1 Corinthians chapter 15. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, I believe verse 7, Paul tells us that before Christ ascended back to heaven, thanks, love, he actually appeared to a number of people, and among those was who?
James.
James. So before this, James, being the half brother of Christ, was not a believer. But Christ appeared to him, and all of a sudden he's a believer. And not only is he a believer, he's somehow gotten to a very prominent position. So turn over to Acts chapter 12. Acts chapter 12 and verse 17. Let's see. Peter is been imprisoned. And Herod has intentions of beheading him to drive his popularity up with the Jewish leadership after he found out that his poll numbers jumped after he beheaded James, the apostle. Yes.
Callie just sent me a text and said she can't get in. Is she in the waiting room?
I do not see Callie.
Oh. Okay, excuse me. That's
everybody. I don't have anybody in the waiting room.
okay.
So yeah, I've got 6 participants, including myself. So I don't have. But I did send her a link.
Oh, okay.
But Acts 12:17, Peter is been released from prison by the angel, and verse 17, it says, "But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison, and he said, 'Tell these things to James and to the brothers.' Then he departed and went to another place." Now this seems odd, because all of a sudden James is, well, not mentioned, and now he's mentioned very prominently. And then in Acts 15, in verse 13, at the Jerusalem conference, Peter has spoken, but then verse 12 beginning, it says, "And all the assembly fell silent, and they listened to Barnabas and Paul as they related what signs and wonders God had done through them among the Gentiles. After they finished speaking, James replied." It's as if he's the conference head of this Holy Spirit-led church conference regarding these matters.
What scripture was that?
Acts chapter 15, verse 13. So James apparently is the moderator of this conference. And and then James 21:18, Acts 21:18, this is the verse that really has me puzzled, because according to Zoadites, James is the head elder in Jerusalem. Well, here's what he says. Acts 21:18, beginning with verse 17. This is talking about Paul and his party. "When we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present." So from this verse, is James or is James not an elder? So I'm asking the question. I don't have the answer. I could see it either way. Before we answer the question, or attempt to, going over to Galatians 1:19, we get some kind of mixed messages about James in Galatians. "But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother." So Paul has gone to Jerusalem. He's telling the Galatians that he had gone to Jerusalem. He saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. We know James is not an apostle. Is he an elder? I don't know. Galatians 2:9. Now this is another verse that has me puzzled. "And when James and Cephas, or Peter, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles, and they to the circumcised." So the word "seems" here puzzles me even more. because obviously Peter and John are apostles, but the role that James fills here is puzzling. And then we just talked about 2 and 12. And then finally, the last mention of James is Jude chapter 1, verse 1, who refers to him as his brother. So Jude, or Judah, is another half-brother of Christ with James as well. So it's obvious, because he's writing a letter to the dispersed Jews. He's certainly a person of great authority of some kind. People look up to him, and what he says matters. But what is his role? I just don't know. So I'm going to open that up to what you might have in your mind about it.
Where was James the apostle killed at? He was killed before this all happened,
Yes,
right?
he was killed in Jerusalem by Herod, and when he did, the Jews were delighted. The Jewish leadership were delighted, and so he decided, hey, this really works. I'm going to try it again with Peter. So he has Peter arrested, and he plans on executing Peter in the same way, but the angel releases Peter from prison, and then he appears at the house where they're all praying for them. They don't want to let him in. They just can't believe it's really him. The young lady keeps telling them, hey, it's really Peter. Hey, it's really Peter. And they said, no, it couldn't be Peter. But yet it is Peter. And first thing he tells them is like, you need to go tell James and the other brethren about this. So he couldn't be referring to James the apostle, because he's recently dead. So he's obviously referring to James, the half-brother of Christ. So I want to know, what is his role and how did he get it? I am just very, very puzzled about this.
Well, the way I look at it is probably too simplistic. I look at the role of James in the same way that I look at the role of Peter. Peter is often listed ahead of the other apostles. On the day of Pentecost, it even says, and they said to Peter and the rest of the apostles. So I look at James as kind of being a natural leader, much like Peter was a natural leader. And we know that that's not uncommon among groups of men, where one will kind of be more at the forefront than others, not necessarily in authority, but in public.
Yes.
And that's how I look at these passages dealing with James, because even in the one where it says with James, and it says, and the rest of the elders, or excuse me, it says, and the elders were all there. That doesn't necessarily exclude him from being there, but it could be saying, him plus the others. That's how I look at it.
Now, he obviously has a big leadership role, but it seems that he just naturally fell into it. And since he was the half-brother of Christ, and he is he's just taking on the mantle of leadership, he's just naturally, people look up to him because of who he is, and because he's taking leadership at a time when the leaders were being tracked down to be killed. So he's obviously a man of great courage as well. But he wasn't without flaw, as no one is. And another thing that really kind of puzzled me was that regarding the Jerusalem conference, it kind of got started because men from James came up to Antioch and told the God-fearers there that in order to become Christians, they first had to be circumcised. So that's my other question. Did James promote this doctrine, or were people that were associated with him promote it, but perhaps he didn't personally himself? So that's my other question that I don't have an answer to, whether he was actually party to this business. Verse 12 of chapter 2 says, "For certain people came from James." For before certain people came from James, Peter was eating with the Gentiles, but when they came, the people from James, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. So is James the head of the circumcision party, or is he just a member of the circumcision party, or is he apart from the circumcision party, but people associated with him are running the circumcision party? I'm puzzled here, and would like your thoughts on that. Is this guilt by association, or is James guilty?
Since Scripture doesn't tell us, all we can do is assume.
Yeah, I think you're right. We just have to be content ourselves that, hey, we don't know. We don't know. I've read several people of late who assert that Mark was the one who stirred this whole thing up after he parted ways with Paul and Barnabas, and the theory is that Mark was of the circumcision party, and he didn't like the way Paul was conducting things, minus the knife. So, but that's again presumption and speculation whether Mark was stirred this whole conference up to start with or not. But the only thing we need to know about that is that Mark and Paul were later reconciled, so it's all good. But anyway, this is the man who's writing to the dispersion, or to the diaspora. My next question is this. This is a very specific letter to a very specific group of people. So how did a very private letter become a general epistle and become the most public of letters that there ever could be, openly proclaimed in the most public of places, the New Testament? How do you go from a private letter to a general epistle?
If he was writing it to that many people, the people who were scattered all around, it wasn't very private.
Okay, all right. It was meant to be distributed. It seems to me, because these people were not in the same place. So
Right.
You had to distribute the letter, and once you get a letter from someone as prominent as James, people naturally are going to distribute it. And what was, by the way, the according to what Paul later says, I can't believe it's either to the Galatians or the Colossians, about, when you finish reading this letter, you need to give it to the next church. But what was the method? And we talked about this some time ago when we studied Brother Lightfoot's book on how we got the Bible. But how did the letters of the New Testament get distributed?
I remember right. You said that they would make a copy of it and then pass it on.
Yes, and before the end of the first century or thereabouts, every congregation essentially had a library of all the books of the New Testament, the various letters to the various churches, because they were addressed primarily to a congregation, but then it would be sent around to others, which is really interesting. We alluded to this in our Revelation notes this past Sunday, that in the book of Revelation, all the clean and all the dirty laundry is put out for everybody to see of the seven churches. All seven of the churches of Asia get to hear everything about every other congregation in this same letter that's read in the assemblies, and so it was the case. I just especially 1 Corinthians. You can imagine when that letter is read all over the known world. But that was the great equalizer, because the New Testament writers were very balanced. They had great things to say, and they had not so great things to say about everybody. But that's essentially how James goes from a letter to a specific group to a general epistle. Now, of course, ultimately, who drives the distribution and the preservation of Scripture? God does. Yeah, Perry?
I was pointing to who restrains.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I have a question. It might be, he addresses this to the 12 tribes, but, there was, as we've studied in past, there's 10 tribes that wandered off and never heard from, and then there was only 2. So is he really addressing it to the 12? I mean, it says 12 tribes, so I believe it's the 12 tribes, but then I hear people say that the 10 tribes were completely lost, but this kind of indicates that maybe there was still 12.
Well, before the Assyrians finished their terrible work, faithful people came out of Israel back down into Judah. In fact, a lot of faithful people from Israel went down into Judah for a number of years, and so you wouldn't have very many, but you'd have members of every tribe somewhere living in Judah, even after the Assyrians had swept everyone out of the land, because the faithful had gone to Judah. But that's, yeah, Perry?
You also have other references in the New Testament to tribes other than Judah and Levi. For example, Anna in Luke chapter 2 is from the tribe of Asher.
Yes.
Which was in the northern kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul in Acts chapter 26, when he is standing before Agrippa, he says that he is standing on the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers. The promise are 12 tribes hope to attain. So it's in the eyes of Paul, there still were 12 tribes. The concept of the 10 tribes being lost is very common, but you think about these New Testament passages, you also think about when Hezekiah was king, he invited some of the northern tribes to come down, and some of them did for the Passover, if you remember that particular story. Then we have when Cyrus became the leader of the empire, when the Persians defeated the Babylonians. We know from Ezra and that he sent back people from the Babylon area, but considering that he was now the empire over also not only the old Babylonian empire but the Assyrian empire, it makes sense that he sent people from all the different areas back to their original lands, because that was the policy, which was a brand new policy of the Persian and Medo-Persian Empire.
Yes.
So people from the other tribes would be coming back home along with those from Judah.
Yeah. technically, Sennacherib destroyed the nation state of Israel, and the nation state of Israel was never reestablished. However, some people who were members of those 10 tribes survived. And of course, the Jews were just adamant about their genealogy. Every Jew apparently could trace their lineage all the way back to Abraham, and the records were kept at the temple in some way or fashion. I'm not really sure exactly how that worked. But before the temple was destroyed, everybody knew who everybody was, and everybody could trace their tribal lineage back to Abraham. At least that's my understanding. But Israel was destroyed. The 10 tribes of Israel were destroyed in a nation-state sense. But not every one of those tribes perished, nor were every one of those tribes taken out of the land. But the vast majority were. At least that's kind of the way I understand it. But according to Zoadetes, the book was written sometime between the stoning of Stephen and Paul's persecution. That all took place likely in the same calendar year, about 35. And this takes place sometime in the next decade or so after these events, but before the household Cornelius brings the Gentiles into the church. So that's kind of the likely dating. Now, he talks about in the book about being a higher purpose to this word diaspora, which, according to the author, means by scattering, by seeding. The idea of the scattering or the seeding is interesting in the Jewish history, because all the diaspora, like from Ur to Haran to Canaan to Egypt to Sinai and back to the land of Canaan, has to do with the growing and the preservation of the seed of woman who became the seed of Abraham, the seed of Isaac, Jacob, Judah, etc. So the idea or the concept of this dispersion or the diaspora is seed scattering. So that's an interesting concept, and that's pretty much articulated by Luke in Acts chapter 8:4, sort of a higher purpose to the diaspora. Now those who were scattered went about preaching the word. So in this case, go ahead, Perry.
You're using the term diaspora in a way I haven't, so don't take this as saying that how you're using it is incorrect. But it was a technical term that was used for the Jews being dispersed all through the Roman Empire, long before Christianity ever came about. So it refers to God scattering Israel and Judah, or the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, during the Assyrian and the Babylonian empires. And if we take that understanding, then to me it adds another angle or two, and that is that these Jews that are being addressed in James, they are a new diaspora, and the term was used to refer to the scattering due to Israel and Judah's sin before, and now them being called the diaspora is them being dispersed not due to their own sin, but the sin of the Jews, in a sense of persecuting. And so it's giving them a dignified, an old term that was used to refer to a derogatory time in their history, but giving it a new meaning and dignifying it. They are now dispersed, not because of their sin, but they are dispersed for the cause of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, it's sort of a, it's kind of turned on its head, so almost. Yeah. I don't have the book in front of me, but the author says that the word diaspora comes from two Greek words, dia and sporos, by which he says means by seed. So I'm just taking his word for it as to what the meaning of that word means. So,
I'm not disagreeing with what you said or what he said.
I wasn't saying anything. That's what he was made a point in the book. So I was just repeating it.
I think he's giving the etymology of the word and not necessarily the history of the word.
That's true. It is. He's talking about the meaning of the actual word, but the point here of Acts 8:4 was, and this is where this scattering comes about, is initially what motivated the Christians in Jerusalem to get out. What was motivating them initially? Persecution. People are seizing your homes and trying to put you in prison and kill you. And so safety, your physical safety, is what initially drove them out of Jerusalem. But God had a higher purpose, or he was going to bless them in a way that they weren't expecting, and that is they went about preaching the word. So, of course, we can't know for sure, but if they hadn't been scattered, would the word have been spread so quickly and so effectively? I think we can safely say no. This was a providential move on the part of God to get the word out to more people, more quickly, more fervently, and safety was achieved, but evangelism was also achieved by this scattering that goes out. So that's an interesting thing that he brings up. He uses just a simple form of greeting, and it's the word greeting. He says, I know who you are, and I know what you are, I know what's going on, and hello, how are you? Is kind of the way he starts things. Again, though, he's writing to specifically Jewish Christians who are being persecuted by their faith and are literally on the run for their very lives, going wherever they can get out of town the quickest. And that's essentially who James is writing to, and he has their interest in mind, and he's thinking about them, and he's thinking about them motivated him to write a letter, and the letter, of course, is being inspired by the Holy Spirit. And we're getting a little ahead of times for next week, but noting their plight, people are on the run with literally a little more than the clothes on their backs. And he writes a letter, and what is the very first message he gives to these people who have lost everything and are literally fleeing for their lives? What is the first message that he gives to them? We're getting ahead of ourselves here. What is it?
Well, if you don't want to get ahead of yourself, there's another message I would suggest.
Okay.
In the title, calling them the 12 tribes in the dispersion, he is honoring them as they have not given up on being Jews.
Yeah.
They are not traitors. They would, of course, be called, blasphemers, like, Paul, persecuted them for, and calling them, the 12 tribes is giving them a note of comfort that even though they are being, as we'll talk about next week, going through various trials, they are still Jews. Now, if you look at the history, if somebody who is Jewish ethnically becomes a Christian today, then they are told they are no longer Jewish. This being something that's been going on for a couple thousand years. I converted a lady who was ethnically a Jew. And she refused to call herself a Christian for years, because to call herself a Christian in her eyes and her teaching was giving up on being a Jew, because you couldn't be a Jew and a Christian at the same time. Mm-hmm. So calling them 12 tribes, he's saying, you are still Jews.
Yes.
I think that would be important to them.
Yes, and when you were saying that, I was thinking about Stephen. Was there ever a more patriotic Jew than Stephen? He loved his nation and his people, and he knew their history just inside out and sideways, and yet he was martyred for Christ, but he was not a turncoat. He was not a quisling. He was a patriot, and really more patriotic of a Jew than the Pharisees that killed him, in if you can be ironic about it. So, yeah, he really is. These are his people. He loves these people, and apparently he's been intimate with so many of them as friends and brethren, and now everybody he's known and guided for the last 10 or 12 years are all gone. James and the apostles are the only ones left in Jerusalem. Everybody they ever knew is left. So it must have been traumatic, not only for the dispersion, but for James and the apostles as well. It really must be difficult. But the first message he gives them is rejoice. It seems to be an ironic message, but rejoice, be glad in your strategic retreat. I can't help but swerve into history, but these events here seem very similar in my mind to what went on at the Battle of Trenton in the Revolution. It was the darkest hour of the Revolution, yet became the brightest hour, because they left and then they came back, and well, it strikes me as being very similar here. But according to the author here, and then I think this is a really strong point, that their lives were guided not by accident, but by providence. And there's no such thing as random or chaos in the life of a Christian. Is there any circumstance in which we find ourselves, or is there any decision that we make that God is caught by surprise at and saying, oh, wow, I don't know what I want to do here? Does that happen?
No.
Not at all. I always remember, and I apologize for keep mentioning this, but I keep remembering Joseph's statement to his brothers in Genesis 49. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. God can take the worst circumstance and turn it into literally salvation. And really, when all is said and done, the salvation of our souls trumps anything and everything we might have to suffer through in this life. So, in essence here, he says, look, the more you're suffering, that means the more God is with you. That he is really with you and is going to preserve you, and he's going to use you in ways that you couldn't imagine otherwise. And so it's really fantastic point that the author makes, because he says, otherwise, and this is apparently, according to the authors, what prompted James to initially to write this letter. What is the great temptation when disaster comes? If you're a Christian and absolute disaster comes, like if, for example, you were in Western Washington and your home is burnt to the ground, what is the great temptation for someone who automatically just in a matter of moments loses everything?
Why did this happen to me?
Yes, despair. This is the great temptation when we face disaster of any kind. If we don't watch it when we lose loved ones, we are tempted to despair. How can I go on without this person? Or recently, down there in Louisiana, people lose their homes to a flood. You know, what's the natural reaction to despair? That is the first temptation that Satan uses to tempt people to turn their back on God, is this thing called despair. And yes.
I think I may disagree with you a little bit.
Okay.
I think despair is part of the grieving process
Okay.
that we go through, and not necessarily a temptation to sin. Now, it can be a temptation to sin if we don't turn in the right direction, but I think God has put the grieving process, which means despair, as part of our normal emotional, response to a bad situation. Especially, I think of the loss of a spouse, that we've been married to for a long time, or something along that line, divorce or something like that. So
that's a great point, because despair in and of itself is just like Joe says, natural course. But if that despair becomes blaming God and becoming angry at God and leaving God because God has allegedly done this to me to punish me in some way, so I'm going to give up on God. And
but I would also say, if we look at Job, it's okay to question God.
Yes.
It's part of that natural working through the process, working through our emotions. And sometimes I think Christians think they can't work through those emotions. They just automatically should ignore those emotions and
Yeah.
things. I've questioned God before.
Uh-huh.
Of course, not in the sense that he was wrong. I just said, why does it happen?
Well,
Why didn't you give me a younger brother? That's what really asked me.
or a brother with more hair.
Oh yeah, exactly.
But I was thinking when you were saying that the great temptation of Paul wrestles with this with the Romans. They were tempted to go back to Moses, and if you're in this dispersion and you're fleeing for your life, when you get to the next place, do you identify as a Christian or you do identify as a Jew? And there was a definite temptation in those years for people just to say, hey, this is too much. I'm just going to go back to what I was, because when I was just a Jew, everything was great, and now everything's turned upside down. Speaking of Romans, I think James wants to. He's without saying it, reminding them that there is a cost to being a Christian. And Paul says in Romans 12, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. And so this, among other things, this scattering reminds these Jewish Christians of the cost of their Christianity. And in this case, short of their life, it's cost them everything. Homes, jobs, families, clothes. I mean, they just left it all. Sometimes moments before the soldiers break down the door. So it's really great to see how these people held up. And the point that Zoadites kind of ends with in today's lesson is he asserts that this cost of being a Christian, this idea of total sacrifice, is diaspora. It is being scattered. And Christians can expect to be scattered in some way or another at some time or several times in their lives, where circumstances will become extremely difficult to deal with. But God will use you in a greater way, in greater despair than He did when you had less despair before. So it's kind of an interesting way of looking at it, but that's pretty much the lesson. It's an hour up here, so before we close, what other things might anyone have to add? Carla, I've been anxiously waiting to hear something you might want to say.
No, just taking it all in. I thought it was a good lesson, and just enjoying the study. I did not get a chance to read ahead of time.
Yeah,
so
I forgot to
I'll
call
be
you
more
on
prepared.
Saturday to get that book back to you. I'm so sorry.
That's right. I will be prepared for next week, though, Lord willing. But yeah, everything was great.
Yeah. So, what other comments might anyone have here? I appreciate everybody's interaction. We want this to be as interactive as possible. Anybody else with a last thought? Perry, thanks in advance for taking next week. I'll shoot you some ideas, and you can take off with it the way you like. So,
Well, saying thanks in advance is like saying when the meal is put on the table, this looks good. That way the compliment's out of the way if it tastes really bad.
Never thought of that like that.
well, we're anticipating a good lesson from you next week. But
Thank you.
I'm sure it'll be great, and I'm sure.
No, I'm questioning. I've had people sit down and say that this looks really good. Now you got me wondering.
Well, the proof is in the pudding. If someone says this looks good and then it's left on the plate, you'll know if they were being honest or not. But we're always just children taught to be polite, and that's what I remember as a child, my mother would tell me, whatever they put in front of you, you go ahead and eat it, and you like it, and you tell them it's great. So, yeah, that's a good illustration. But Effie, I know your food looks good and tastes good. I don't have to worry about that. Never ate anything you cooked that I didn't like.
Thank you.
So
See, that's a compliment afterwards.
yes, it is. Yeah. So
My dear wife told on me because I told her that's a little secret that my mom taught us, that when we sit down, when we're invited someplace, oh, this looks really good. That way, if it's really bad, your compliment's out of the way.
Yeah.
So we were sitting down at her mom's house. I said, this looks really good. And then my dear wife told on me. Girlfriend told on me.
Yeah.
Said, well, Mom, what he's doing is, it's like,
Well, see, that could boomerang too, because if you say that, sometimes your gracious host may say, well, here, we'll give you some more if it looks that good. And they'll heap another spoon of whatever it is on your plate, and now you got twice the problem.
So does this principle apply before a lesson to the preachers? Boy, I'm really looking forward to an excellent lesson. So, something like that?
Well,
yes, Joey, it does, because then I finally might get a compliment out of you.
well, Zig Ziglar talked about truth told in advance. It's not a lie, it's a truth told in advance.
Eternal hope, right?
Yeah, there you go. But
With joy, he'd be saying, I'm really looking forward to this short sermon today.
yeah.
That's even better.
Well, I've never used the word short and sermon in the same sentence yet. As Tony can attest to, and Effie and
Lois just said amen.
well, yeah, well, usually though, my sermons are shorter than my longest one.
Oh, okay.
But sometimes a short sermon can seem a lot longer than it really is too. So it just it's if you have ears to hear.
Does Tony know that he led singing on Facebook last year?
Yes.
Yes, I knew Russ, but I didn't know it until afterward.
Yeah, I forgot to turn the camera off when I stepped away from the podium.
Well, your song leader might not have bothered me, but
But anyway, who knows? Now we're going to have some more viewers because of what you said, Effie. Thank you. Now everybody will want to go to YouTube to Archdale Church of Christ and watch last Sunday's sermon. Fast forward to the end to hear Tony sing. So, well, anyway, everyone, thank you again. Sure appreciate your attendance, and we'll look forward to seeing everyone next week. And God bless you all.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
bye. Thanks, everyone.
Here.